Pruitt-Igoe was not just a housing project, it was a Cold War era environment where testing occurred on a living population. Residents, many of them children, described men in protective suits, hazmats, trucks moving through the neighborhood, spraying, taking place in open air. They were not told what was happening. To them, it was their normal. That's the point. A controlled test was conducted in an uncontrolled, unconsenting community. They saw people spraying substances in their environment. They were not alarmed because no one told them to be. Some even described those trucks resembling everyday vehicles, ice cream trucks, because that's how normalized it felt. Only later, when illnesses started appearing in their communities and friends, did those memories take on a different meaning. The US military used zinc cadmium sulfide in dispersion tests across St. Louis. The purpose was to study how particles would move through a city. That means residential buildings, schools, public spaces were all part of the test environment. This was not isolated, it was urban scale exposure, forced concentration of Black residents into specific areas. So when testing occurred, it occurred in communities that had already been politically contained and economically restricted. And that overlap matters. Survivors and families have reported cancer, chronic illness, generational health concerns. They began connecting those outcomes to what they experienced during the Cold War period. These claims have driven community organizing, demands for recognition, and calls for compensation and investigation. The St. Louis Andele Mami Trust exists because of this. It is structured around survivor health care, maternal and family repair, environmental remediation, cultural and ancestral restoration. It does not frame it as a charity. It defines it as restitution for unconsented exposure and systemic harm. St. Louis was also impacted by uranium processing, radioactive waste storage, contamination pathways affecting soil and water, so the region carried multiple layers of exposure at once. Chemical testing, radiological contamination were not isolated issues. They existed in the same geographic environment. Pruitt-Igoe is often reduced to a failed housing project, but the full picture includes Cold War experimentation, environmental exposure, segregated policy structures, economic abandonment. So the real question is not why did the buildings fail? It is what conditions were people living under while they were there? This was a populated community. Families lived there, children grew up there, and within that environment, testing occurred without consent, without transparency. The consequences are still being addressed today. Pruitt-Igoe was a large public housing development in St. Louis built in the 1950s. It consisted of 33 high-rise buildings designed under modernist planning principles intended to house low-income residents. It was initially segregated, Pruitt for Black residents, Igoe for white residents. Segregation ended legally, but disinvestment followed. By the 1960s, maintenance declined, vacancies rates increased, basic services failed. The buildings were demolished starting in 1972. Pruitt-Igoe is often described as an architectural failure. That is incomplete. The actual contributing factors included underfunding from the start, poor maintenance budgets, loss of middle-income residents, urban job decline, population loss in St. Louis.